But I think it's something that I also thought about more after living and working in Japanese culture. Because I think, especially in Western modernism, creativity has often been equated with, I've never seen that before. You know, that it has to be like iconoclastic. Otherwise, it's not creative. If it doesn't seem even a little bit weird, then it's not truly creative. And this, I think, is probably more inside the artistic community itself, that we respect that thing that seems to be original, that we equate it with originality in a very overt, in-your-face kind of sense.
Not long ago, I wrote a book about my life on the creative edge as a composer, improviser, and producer. I knew how creativity worked for me, but now I want to know more. So I'm sitting down with dancer and choreographer Mary Jean Cowell. She spent her career at the crossroads between the Western avant-garde and the art of Japan. I'm looking for some serious inspiration.
There are very different responses to movement in different cultures. That the kind of angular, tense movement, what we would see as angular and tense that I might use to express anxiety or something like that, occurs a lot in Balinese dance and doesn't necessarily have the negative connotations. It has a lively, energetic, and interesting vitality to it, but it isn't necessarily negative. It's not necessarily saying, watch out or be afraid or something like that. So most of the time, the way that Japanese culture has impacted my work has been something that the audience probably would never say, oh, that looks odd, that looks Asian, that looks like something from another culture. It's been a much deeper level. The most specific thing I can think of is a solo I did actually to a Liszt piece of music, so very Western, right, very 19th century, very romantic, and it was a comedic piece. But the springboard there, in terms of where does the idea come from, was classical Japanese dance, a certain kind of it. And it structurally, the dance is done to a piece of music that is very slow. It's a song, but the words are so drawn out that even the Japanese ear these days would probably have trouble understanding all the content of the song. And parts of it are therefore not metrically rhythmic the way that most Western dance music is. Yeah? But then there are interludes, which are accompanied by a stringed instrument, that become very rhythmic, very overtly rhythmic. And during those parts of the dance, the dancer has to be right on the beat, the way that we do in the West. But during the narrative parts, you're essentially doing what I call a highly abstract kind of mime. The movement is so you have little variations you can do with the timing. You're listening to the music, she's writing a letter, you take your sleeve and you write the letter, but you don't have to be on the beat at all. You're just working with that idea in the text. And so I thought that's interesting because you're going back and forth kind of between an actor mode in the West, in which you're working with the idea more than any abstract rhythmic structure. But then on the other hand, in the same piece, you have to suddenly be very concise musically. So I took that and with the Liszt part, with the Liszt music, certain parts I took gestural material from the West. It was about this lady having a bad day, essentially. She couldn't get her act together. So there were all sorts of gestures that went at different rhythm, and they were very precise. I set the gestural vocabulary, and at certain times it was very clear that it had to be that. And then there were other parts where she just seemed to roam around a bit. And there are parts in the music that lent themselves more to that. The rhythm was less dominant. So for me, it was an exploration of taking that idea from Japanese classical dance into a Western solo, but no one ever got that. And that was fine with me. It was a springboard for me. And one that I really enjoyed working with and seemed to work for the audience because it always worked comedically. But why it worked was coming from a different source.
In food, for example, all of a sudden we have little tiny remnants of sushi and all kinds of stuff. All this fusion food and fusion everything, you know?
Lots of fusion.
And it sounds to me like fusion isn't what you're looking for.
Well, if it happens, I think the old statement, the whole has to be greater than the sum of its parts. You know, if I see something and I think, oh, they saw Chinese opera. And, or, oh, I saw they saw Balinese dance and they really like this. But there's ballet or modern dance or jazz or something in there too, and it just seems as if they're not really cohesive, that a cohesive aesthetic doesn't come out of the piece. I'm seeing like the buffet with some sushi and a hamburger on it, and it doesn't work for me. You know, I think it's just fine that people are experimenting with it, but very often I think, again, they don't get past that fascination with, gee whiz, I've never seen something like that before. I think I'll try to do that. And part of the problem is that some of the things that people borrow are really difficult to borrow, but to our eye, we don't know it. And so we come up with this kind of bland imitation. When I was studying classical Japanese dance, they always teach the Western people first the male, because it's the male style, because it's much more open, it's the way we move, it uses space in bigger ways, and you can spread out in the space, and it's just more externalized energy. The female, everything's turned in. You know, you train to do the female, whether you're a male actor in the kabuki theater or a woman. The idea is that your knees are pressed together at all times, so when you walk, you're toed in, and your weight is back, so you seem to be very passive. You're working like crazy because your thighs are holding you up. So it's very, very difficult, and on top of all that, there's this kind of S curve that's supposed to go through the body in this undulating way. And when you see it done by an expert, it's extremely beautiful. And I was never able to do it without feeling totally silly and uncoordinated. And even a simpler thing, there was this head thing that occurred in a lot of the Japanese dances that was essentially 3 different focus points. Something like here, here, and there. And again, I can't do it. I cannot do it correctly, but it was a lovely thing at this moment that was very clear here. Then there was a slight tilt and roll of the head, and you were there. And I will see things that I know people are doing, not necessarily even from Japanese dance, but I'll think, there's something more going on in that when someone highly skilled does it. But if you lift it out of its whole context, unless you make it something different enough that I can accept it on its own terms.
Well, so 2 things kind of occur to me about that. One is that I know you spent many years studying Japanese theater and dance, and so you have a very much more in-depth knowledge of that than I would say many people. So your perception or your appreciation for it is much deeper and richer, probably, than somebody like me who's been there, you know, for a couple of weeks and thought, gee, that's cool.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, obviously it's trivial compared to what you've done. And
well, but I mean, I think if you see something really good, you know it. Yeah. You may not even know why it's really good. It took me a while to figure out one of the reasons I really loved this particular Onagata, a male actor doing female parts in kabuki, was his extraordinary musicality. And it took me a while because, of course, the musicality wasn't the same as musicality in a Western dancer, because the kind of thing being performed wasn't the same. Well, it was the same in the sense that it was masterly, but in a different context. And I mean, when you say no Japanese theater in depth, there's so many different forms. I would not regard myself, especially not now after I haven't lived there for a while, and gone to the theater as much as I used to. Obviously, I go with more experience than many people, but there's just so much depth there and so much variety. There are some theater forms, a lot of folk theater forms in Japan that I've never seen, that I'd love to see, But you have to be there at the right season, because they only do it once a year, that kind of thing. One of the things that's so interesting about Japanese art is that early on acceptance of a more abstract form of representation. You know, that they didn't get into the whole Western-based art is imitation of life kind of perspective until they were influenced from the West. So you get all these interesting representations that, you know, okay, that's supposed to be a man, or we are enacting this. But the interest in stylized representation, not full-out abstract, the way we think of abstract now, but is very interesting, and I think was, of course, very influential at the beginning of modernism in the West, because Japanese prints were a major influence on the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, and I think that's why, because it was like a bridge between the end of realistic representation and then just, okay, yeah, I'm representing an idea anyway, so I don't have to do it and make it look like what we would now say a realistic representation is. So I think that was one of the things, and remains one of the things that can be very interesting, no matter how much depth of experience you have when you just see that array of ways of representing something in a stylized way.
You know, to me, that kind of goes back to the initial thing I wondered about, is how do you keep that focus? And one of the things that's always impressed me is that, you know, this focus that you seem to always have a handle on is always towards this idea of excellence. And I wondered how you think about excellence in your work. It seems like it's an important part of it to me.
Well, doesn't it kind of relate to the idea that art, big topic again, is bigger than any one artist? When I was working with a theater company in Japan, I worked with a man, Abe Cowell, who was a novelist, but he also wrote plays. And he had this experimental theater company. So I was working with them, teaching modern dance and choreographing for some of their shows. And he was interviewed prior to the opening of the first show I did with him. And among the questions they asked him was something along the lines of, what do you like least about the whole process? And he said, oh, let me try to get this right. It was something about, he hated trying to finish it because he felt it wasn't going to be fully satisfying. You know, because what he was aiming for was always going to be slightly beyond him. But that propelled him to want to do the new work. So he was always kind of thinking, okay, now what's the next new idea? And I saw this in the show we did because 3 nights before we opened, he was rewriting the lines for the final scene. You know, because he just kept, and they were crucial. It really changed the feeling of that final act, the line changes he was making. So I knew that he was really trying to get the clearest sense of what he was saying in that. And I think that you want the idea to be represented as clearly as possible. So sometimes you're wrestling with, okay, I think the idea is this, but on the other hand, it might be a little, but you want to try to be as honest and authentic in what you're doing. And so that's, I mean, the piece I did most recently, I made some changes, small changes, but ones I felt were very effective in the last week when we went into the theater. I did make some changes because I saw certain things could happen. And I think that is part of it too. The process gives you opportunities to see things. But you want if you're pursuing something that's larger than yourself, you know, that's a challenge in terms of excellence. You know that you can always do better. You know, when you study Japanese culture and all the traditional arts like haiku, Japanese dance, kabuki theater, the whole process is you learn the tradition. And then when you have assimilated that and you know it well, then you demonstrate your creativity by taking something in it. If it's poetry, maybe, you know, the hackneyed cherry blossoms, and you find some way to use cherry blossoms in a way that everyone says, oh, if you know the tradition, you know that's something new, and that's extraordinarily creative because it shows the depth of your understanding of what's been done before. You're not just kind of trying to think, okay, I don't want to talk about cherry blossoms. What flower has no one ever talked about? let me write a poem about that. And that will be creative. It's a different sense of creativity, and it requires more connoisseurship on the part of the viewer, and it requires more willingness on the part of the individual to assimilate the tradition. And until the 20th century, we were much more into that in the West too. You know, you apprenticed and you learned the tradition, and after that, then you expressed your individual style and your creativity, but you didn't feel it was necessary to totally, obviously reject everything out of your past. So I think we maybe have an exaggerated sense of creativity when we identify it with originality, something that's just shocks me practically. You know. And I think probably that sells better within the artistic milieu than it does with the general public. But they would rather not be quite so shocked.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.